My name is Samantha Arango, and I chose Cuba for my final presentation because of my family's heritage. All of my grandparents on both sides of the family were born in Cuba and coincidentally moved to New Jersey during the 1950s. The grandmother I'm closest to is not very educated and left Cuba before the revolution, so I wanted to do my own research on the country to find out more about where we're from. I'd like to start with quick facts about Cuba. The official name of Cuba is the Republic of Cuba. The capital is Havana. The official language is Spanish, and the population is 11.48 million. Cuba has had a communist system since 1959, but constitutionally defined as a Marxist-Leninist socialist state. The main religion is Roman Catholic, with 60% of the population identifying, and the remaining 40% is comprised of many different religions. I would like to point out in the racial and ethnic demographics that approximately 36% is non-white, and I'll revisit this later when I discuss race relations in Cuba. I'd like to give a quick overview of Cuban history prior to 1959. I chose 1959 as a transition point in my presentation because it was a significant year that led to many changes in the country. Before 1492, Cuba and other Caribbean islands were occupied by the Taino people, which formed communities of up to 3,000 people, and they got their food from fishing and agriculture. They named the island Cubanacan, which is where the current name Cuba came from. Columbus landed on the island in October of 1492. Although the Taino people were living on the island successfully, Columbus saw them as nothing more than savages and claimed the island for Spain. In 1511, Diego Velázquez de Cuellar established Baracoa, the first Spanish settlement on the island. La Guerra de los 10 Años began in 1868 when Carlos Manuel de Céspedes freed his slaves so they can fight with him for Cuba's independence from Spain. This was the first Cuban War for independence. Although it failed, Spain promised to make changes in their leadership, but more importantly, Cubans proved that they're able to unite and mobilize against Spain. In 1886, a royal decree from Spain abolished slavery in Cuba and also made patronato, a form of indentured servitude, illegal. By the end of the slave era, Cuba had almost 500,000 slaves. This influx of African people contributed to the racial diversity and rich Afro-Cuban culture that still exists today, but it also created an inherently racist system. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the United States took control of Cuba away from Spain. Just 3 years later, on May 20th, 1902, Cuba became an independent nation and gave Guantanamo Bay to the U.S. Fulgencio Batista was in and out of power until he was overthrown in 1959. His leadership was characterized by corruption, and he widened the gap between the rich and the poor. His corrupt dictatorship caused Fidel Castro and Che Guevara to lead a revolution against him. The Cuban Revolution lasted from 1953 to 1959, when Batista was successfully overthrown. Castro coming into power marked a turning point for Cuba. His regime brought a lot of changes. He allied with the Soviet Union and established communism, and he nationalized all businesses, including U.S.-owned businesses. The first area of change in post-1959 Cuba that I would like to cover is the healthcare system. The healthcare system of Cuba is 100% run by the government. Privatized doctors' offices and hospitals do not exist there, which makes healthcare services much more easily accessible to the public. Universal healthcare is in the Cuban Constitution as a fundamental human right that will be provided by the government. Approximately 11% of the country's gross domestic product is spent on healthcare. The Ministry of Health puts a huge emphasis on prevention and primary care. That shift toward primary care occurred in the 70s and 80s when there were a lot of reforms in the healthcare system. Unlike in the United States, people in Cuba have access to preventive care services such as compulsory annual checkups. Here, preventive care is not very affordable, and most people have to wait until there is a big problem before addressing it. It is obviously much less costly and more beneficial to the patient to prevent major health issues from occurring rather than waiting until the problem is much bigger and much more expensive to treat. Over 95% of children are vaccinated and protected from 13 preventable diseases. Universal vaccinations and other programs have succeeded in eradicating a handful of diseases like tuberculosis and polio. Cubans have the highest life expectancy in Latin America. Males are expected to live 77 years and females 81 years. In 2015, Cuba became the first country to eradicate mother-to-child transmission of HIV and syphilis. Cuba has a National Center for Sex Education that ensures Cubans have comprehensive sex education and access to contraceptives and abortions. Cuba has 6 levels of healthcare facilities which are listed on this slide. The smaller facilities serve smaller communities and are more geared toward preventive and primary care. As you go further down the list, these facilities get bigger, serve larger populations, and also the services they provide become more specialized. The second area of change in post-1959 Cuba that I would like to cover is the education system. The adult literacy rate in Cuba is 100%. They have the best education system in Latin America, despite being one of the poorest countries in the region. Private institutions were nationalized and education was made public and free when Castro came into power. The education system in Cuba is completely run by the government. Cuba spends about 13% of their gross domestic product on the education system. After Fidel came into power, the eradication of illiteracy was prioritized. Literate people traveled to teach others how to read, and in 1961, illiteracy was eradicated throughout the country. Ever since then, with the education system being nationalized and free, many students were able to enroll and get an education, regardless of wealth and status. And this includes upper-level education. Graduate education is free as well. Education in Cuba is compulsory from ages 6 to 16, which consists of primary and secondary education. Primary education teaches the basics like reading, writing, and math. Before 1959, only 55.1% of children completed primary school. As of 2011, 99.7% of children were attending or had completed primary school. Secondary education is split into 2 levels. The first is basic secondary, which is 7th through 9th grade. This part is compulsory. After basic secondary is pre-university secondary, which is 10th through 12th grade. The goal is to prepare students for university level education. Students have the option to enter vocational school after 9th or 12th grade, in which the goal is to produce skilled workers. University education is similar to what we have here, except it's free. As of 2017, primary school completion is above 90% and secondary school enrollment is above 80%. Tertiary or university education enrollment is 28% for males and 40% for females. There are deep African roots in Cuba, which of course means there's a lot of racial diversity, but also racial inequality. Revisiting the demographics I mentioned earlier, you can see that white Cubans still make up the majority of the population. Mestizo and black Cubans make up about 36% of the population of Cuba. During the early 1900s, there was a movement toward blanqueamiento, or whitening of the country. And although Cuba's heritage was a mixture of African and Spanish roots, the African side was being silenced by the Spanish side. Afro-Cubans continued to acknowledge and celebrate their culture. Carnaval was a display of their culture, including Santeria, which is a religion based on African Yoruba, and Son, which is a music genre that has heavy African influence. Son music was banned during Blanqueamiento. There was a cultural identity movement at the time called Cubanidad. Oppressed Afro-Cubans wanted to express their Cuban culture regardless of skin color and emphasize the fact that Cuba is a melting pot and no one person is more Cuban than the next. There are systematic economic disparities between white and black Cubans due to the dual currency system in place. The Cuban convertible peso is equivalent to the US dollar and worth 25 times more than the Cuban peso. Jobs that pay in Cuban convertible peso are mainly in the tourism sector, and these jobs are very biased toward white Cubans. This leaves black Cubans to find jobs elsewhere where they're paid in the less valuable Cuban peso. How can these racial disparities in Cuba be fixed? What can Cubans do to help? Well, it's hard to fix the problem when nobody actually believes the problem exists. Racism was outlawed and, quote, eradicated when Castro won the Cuban Revolution and took Batista's place. Since racism was declared illegal, it's as if it does not exist. So until the problem is recognized and properly addressed by a large group of citizens, it will not go away. However, there's no freedom of speech or opinion in Cuba, so citizens can't exactly rise up against the government and stand up for themselves. So I truly don't see how this problem can go away anytime soon. I'll wrap up my presentation with some information about the country as it is today. Miguel Diaz-Canel was sworn in as president about a year ago. He's both the president and the prime minister. But Raul Castro is not president anymore, but he still has a lot of power. He leads the Communist Party, which is the one political party in the country. There was a new constitution in 2019, about a month ago, and this is the first time since 1976 that they have rewritten the constitution. This constitution set the term limit for presidency, recognition of private property. It restored the presumption of innocence to the justice system, which is definitely a big step toward, human rights. And it introduced the right to legal counsel immediately upon arrest, which also big step in the right direction for human rights. Also, unemployment in Cuba is currently at 2.6%. And that's all. I really hope that you enjoyed my presentation, and here are some references if you would like to learn more about the country. Thank you.